Today I'm going to talk about the Sino-Soviet relations during the Cold War, but to begin the conversation, we're going to go talk a little bit about geography of the situation first, and you're going to notice here on the map that China and the Soviet Union and countries within the Soviet bloc share quite a border, over 4,500 miles of common border between the two of them. Their close proximity to each other, they're bordering nations, led to a lot of conflict over the years between Russia and later the Soviet Union and China. In the 19th century, China loses some territory to Russia along their border, as well as facing Western domination. In 1911, you might recall that the Qing dynasty will fall. That's the last of the dynastic empires of China. And not much later, the new Soviet Union continues to threaten and strip land from a now weaker China. In the 1930s and into the 40s, the Chinese Civil War pitted two main entities, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist Kuomintang Party, and Mao Zedong and his Chinese Communists. During this war, you would think that the Soviet Union would be supportive of Mao Zedong, but they're really not. Joseph Stalin would just as soon see Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's forces continue to fight and weaken China overall than to be victorious and become a possible threat to the Soviet Union. By 1949, of course, the Civil War is going to be won by Mao Zedong and the Communists, with Chiang Kai-shek and his forces being relegated to the small island of Taiwan off the southeast coast of the mainland of China. Now, with regards to Stalin and Mao's relationship, it starts off on a pretty rocky foot. Of course, the Soviet Union is not very supportive of the Communist Revolution and the Communist Party within the Civil War. And then even after the victory of the Chinese Communists, the relationship doesn't get that much better. In 1950, Mao Zedong is invited to Moscow to meet with Joseph Stalin, and while the two will sign a treaty of alliance, or a treaty of friendship as it was called, that created some economic relationships and created some cultural ties between the nations, Mao felt that he was not treated as a foreign dignitary should have been treated. The red carpet was not rolled out for him. He wasn't treated with the utmost of respect that he thought he deserved. And this is largely because Joseph Stalin wanted to make sure Mao Zedong knew his place and that he would certainly be no more than second fiddle to the Soviet Union. Through this treaty of friendship, the Soviet Union will aid China with loans to be paid back with interest. They will also send scientists and weapons experts, architects to China to help them develop. The first major issue that's going to bring the Soviet Union and China more closely in conflict, ultimately, is going to be the Korean War. If we recall the story in the Korean War, Kim Il-sung, who was propped up as leader of North Korea by the Soviet Union, wants to unite all of the Korean peninsula. He contacts the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin for assistance in doing this, and Joseph Stalin directs Kim Il-sung to Mao. Upon contacting Mao, who is obviously reluctant to help out Kim Il-sung in 1950, so soon after finishing his own war, Mao is not too sure he wants to help, but there is hope that, down the road, if supporting Kim Il-sung will gain him favor with Joseph Stalin, possibly Joseph Stalin will help Mao in the future to gain back control over Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan being an island, Mao is going to need a navy, Mao is going to need a strong air force to be able to take that, and those are things that the Soviet Union could certainly help with. You see here a photo of Chinese soldiers crossing over the Yalu River into North Korea, and this is months after the war began, when the Americans and the United Nations forces had pushed the North Korean army almost to the northern border of the country, threatening at that point to maybe move into China. So Chinese forces move in, and they will continue to fight a long and very costly war. At the conclusion of the war, the Chinese hope that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union will help foot some of the bill for the war, and that will not happen. And this is going to cause further animosity between the Soviet Union and China. Joseph Stalin passes away in 1953, and this leaves Mao Zedong as pretty much the old guard now of communist leaders in the world. And again, as the leader of the most populous nation in the world, Mao sees himself as the leading force of global communism, not the Soviet Union. And to bring America into the picture, this is obviously the opposite of what we think. Ever since NSC 68 was released in 1950, the United States has seen every communist activity as one that's directed from Moscow, certainly not Beijing. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about Nikita Khrushchev and his relationship with Mao Zedong in China, and what is known as the Sino-Soviet Split that begins really in 1956. Nikita Khrushchev is going to be the next premier of the Soviet Union after a couple years of power struggle. He rises to the premiership in 1955. In 1956, Khrushchev will give what's known as his secret speech to the Communist Party in Moscow, where he works to denounce the cult of personality that Stalin had created. Now, while this might ease some tensions in the Soviet Union, it's going to be heard by outsiders like Mao Zedong, and at least for Mao's position, he sees Nikita Khrushchev as being far weaker than Joseph Stalin had been. So, and then also word of Nikita Khrushchev's hope for peaceful coexistence with the United States. It violates everything that Mao stands for. Mao wants attack of the United States. Mao wants to conquer the United States. Certainly nothing like peaceful coexistence. So Mao begins to talk quite a big game that it is he and China that are the forefront of global communism, and not Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. In 1958, Khrushchev is invited to Beijing, and every bit of the disrespect that Mao felt he received in 1950 was returned upon Nikita Khrushchev in 1958, coming to a head with the infamous swimming pool summit, I guess we can call it, where Mao Zedong wanted to hold a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev, who was no swimmer himself, in Mao's swimming pool, merely to embarrass Nikita Khrushchev. So obviously we can see that the relationship between the two is quite strained. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward is one of the most terrible instances of the 20th century as a whole, but certainly in Chinese history, in modern Chinese history. The Great Leap Forward's goal was to revolutionize Chinese industry and agriculture to help both grow at a dramatic pace. And to do that, as you can see in the photo here, the massive population of China would be exploited. And in the back of the picture there, you can see what are known as backyard furnaces, where peasant families and peasant villages would be made by the government to produce their own steel out of their own farming implements and out of their own agricultural implements, essentially. This, rather than resulting in an increase in agricultural production and an increase in industrial production, would result in one of the greatest famines the world had ever seen. From 1958 to 1961, it's estimated that possibly 14 to 30 million people died in this famine in China, led by Mao Zedong in the Great Leap Forward. And certainly agricultural production did not increase. Despite the fact that millions of people were dying, Mao continued to export grain around the world in hopes of convincing the world that China was actually doing quite well, and they were wealthy enough to continue to support other nations and continue to sell grain on a global market. The Soviet Union denounces Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward. This pushes Mao even further away from the Soviet Union, and he now moves to back any country around the world that would dissent from Moscow. And this will be particularly important for newly decolonized African nations that are looking for large and powerful benefactors. Another story that is going to continue the rift between the Soviets and the Chinese is going to be the Sino-Indian War in 1962. What begins as a border war, and really doesn't evolve into much more than that between the Chinese and the Indians, will cause this greater rift between the Soviets and the Chinese. The Soviets proclaim themselves neutral in this war. However, they're going to sell MiG fighters, their Soviet fighter jets, to the Indians during the conflict. The result of the war, China claims they win, but there's not really any territory that's gained or lost. But the result is pushing the Soviet Union and China even further from each other. The Soviet Union aids the enemy of China, and this is obviously going to strain that relationship. Another issue that's going to further strain the relationship between China and the Soviet Union is the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we recall how the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved peacefully through negotiations, with the United States agreeing to remove missiles from Turkey and to not oust Fidel Castro, and the Soviet Union agreeing to remove their missiles from Cuba, obviously no nuclear war resulted. Mao will condemn Khrushchev for backing down in this case. He saw this as a situation where Khrushchev should have used those weapons and should have opened a war with the United States. Further issues are going to be strained when Mao Zedong institutes what's known as the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. And here we see two Chinese men who are being chastised by government officials for being capitalists and traitors. The Cultural Revolution was a period of really terror to anyone in China that was seen as dissenting from the government or in opposition to the principles and the beliefs of the Maoist regime. Any harbinger of old thought in China was attacked, and by 1969, more than 500,000 Chinese will be dead in this Cultural Revolution. Again, the Soviets denounced this as fanaticism. Another wrinkle to this story is this Chinese development of nuclear weapons. Naturally, the Soviet Union would just assume not see the Chinese develop their own nuclear weapons, but they will do just that. By 1964, the Chinese detonate their first atomic bomb. By 1967, their first hydrogen bomb. And by 1970, their first space satellite launch, which, remember, is not monumental for the fact that they launched a satellite into orbit. It's monumental for the fact that they have a missile technology that can get a satellite into orbit. The tension will increase another notch with the rise to power of Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. Brezhnev is going to become the premier of the Soviet Union in 1968, and he initially comes in taking a much harder line, especially towards countries that are in opposition to the Soviet Union, than Nikita Khrushchev had in his last years. And Mao feared that Brezhnev might turn his attention towards China. And in fact, this would be the case in 1969 when the Chinese and the Soviets would fight a brief border war, where a border dispute erupted into small skirmishes in 1969. There were fears of, but no actual escalation, obviously, to nuclear war. But there were a few hundred casualties on each side. This would be the lowest point in Sino-Soviet relations. Further strain in the two would come with the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. The Sino-Vietnamese War, obviously, this comes after the American involvement in Vietnam and after North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, and there is now one communist Vietnam that is supported largely by the Soviet Union. As communism spread to Cambodia and Laos next door, the Chinese looked to support the Cambodian and Laotian communist movements. In Cambodia, there was a communist movement led by a man named Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge government. And this was particularly brutal, with orchestrating one of the most harsh genocides of the 20th century. Fearing that a Khmer Rouge-like revolution might make its way into Vietnam, the country of Vietnam will actually invade Cambodia in 1978 to support a governmental change in Cambodia. Well, as Cambodia is friendly with China, China will return in kind and invade Vietnam. And Vietnam, remember, is supported by the Soviet Union. So this is a situation where obviously you have China invading a client state of the Soviet Union to some degree, and you have China supporting the Khmer Rouge regime, a regime that the entire world could see for its genocidal actions. China does not look very good at this point. There would be better times ahead in the 1980s. From 1982 to the year 2000, we can say there was some level of coming together between the Soviet Union and China, or later Russia and China. And this is known as rapprochement, where there's going to be relaxation in tensions. This will come from Mao's death. Mao is gone. The overthrow in China of the anti-Soviet Gang of Four, the cadre that ran China after the death of Mao Zedong, and the rise of the man you see on the right, Deng Xiaoping, who wanted a more tolerant relationship with the Soviet Union, and the West, in hopes of helping grow China's economy. Also, we can add to that, Leonid Brezhnev passed away in 1982, and a few years after that, we'd have the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev. You can see on the left on this photo, Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping, both for their part, moved to usher in pretty dramatic reforms to each of their countries, politically speaking, to some degree, and economically speaking. Gorbachev, for his part, would make it a goal to improve relations with China and to open new trade agreements and new cultural agreements. The Soviet Union would end their disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, and Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, called perestroika and glasnost, would encourage reformers in China. Now, these reformers in China and the people that advocated for more change in China would take to the streets in May of 1989 as Mikhail Gorbachev is preparing to make a summit to China. Protests would grow in a central square in Beijing known as Tiananmen Square. And on June 4th, 1989, Chinese troops would be sent in to disperse a crowd in Tiananmen Square, resulting in hundreds or possibly thousands dead. There's no way to know exactly the final outcome of this. You see here photoed a man who's now simply known as Tank Man, who dared to step in front of a column of Chinese tanks, who would attempt for many moments to drive around him and dodge him. But the tanks, for their part, did not go over him. It's not known to this point whatever happened to Tank Man, outside of the belief that he was arrested and likely executed shortly after this incident. The Tiananmen Square massacre was condemned soundly around the world, and this just gives us the reminder that though China did make some economic reforms, they still are a very politically unfree country, and that's pretty much where we leave it here. In 1991, we have the official fall of the Soviet Union, following their years of reform under Mikhail Gorbachev. And China is still left standing, and China feels that their position of offering economic reforms, yet still holding on to tight political control over the nation, was the correct one. And now China is the largest communist and most powerful communist nation in the world, though it would be difficult to argue that they still truly are a communist nation at heart. In the last 20 years, China has made great movements towards being a major world player and has continued to offer economic reforms, but they have ceased their push for an international communist revolution. And stay tuned shortly for another lecture on Sino-American relations.